Whether it is based on their line of work, being the victim of a crime, or simply just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, there are some people who disappear under some extremely suspicious circumstances after having knowledge that someone doesn't want them to have or doesn't want to get out. Starting off our list in our number 10 spot, we have Warren G. Hooper. Warren G. Hooper was a 40-year-old state senator in Michigan. In this state in the 1940s, political corruption was a huge problem, and it was quite common for politicians and legislators to accept bribes in exchange for votes. After Warren confessed to accepting a $500 bribe for his vote on a horse racing bill, he was offered immunity if he testified as a witness in front of a grand jury. On January 11th of 1945, just a few days before his testimony was scheduled, Warren was driving to his home but never made it there. His car was found in flames shortly after on the side of the road, and the body of Warren was found in the front seat with 3 bullet holes found in his head. To make matters more suspicious, there were 2 other witnesses who were also supposed to testify in the same case, and they were both also found dead under suspicious circumstances as well. This is when a gang called the Purple Hill Gang began to come into the investigation. The Purple Hill Gang was a group that really controlled Detroit during the 1920s and 30s. There were rumors swirling that a former state treasurer named Frank McKay, who was under investigation in this grand jury case, was behind the killings of the witnesses, including Warren's. It was believed that Frank had bribed a deputy warden to temporarily release 2 of the imprisoned Purple Hill Gang leaders so that they could commit the horrible crime against Warren and then promptly return to the jail, which would give them a pretty solid alibi. 4 former members of the Purple Hill Gang did end up getting charged with conspiracy to commit murder because of the testimony of an informant that they had once approached him and asked him to take Warren's life. And while the 4 were convicted, they received quite short sentences, and one of the convictions was even later overturned. In our number 9 spot today, we have Michael Mansfield. Michael was a 19-year-old student at Lincoln College in Illinois, and he lived with another student named Russell Smrekar. Russell ended up being expelled from the school after being charged with burglary for stealing a guitar and some record albums from another dorm room. After his theft, he had given the stolen albums to Michael, and in order to avoid being charged with possession of stolen property, Michael agreed to testify against Russell. This took place in 1975, and on New Year's Eve of that year, Michael was spending the holiday at his parents' house when he told them he was headed out to see a friend. Unfortunately, Michael was never seen again after this night, and of course because of the loss of the witness, the charges were dropped against Russell. Although extremely suspicious, this alone of course didn't mean that Russell had anything to do with Michael's disappearance, but just you wait. In our number 8 spot today, we have Ruth Martin. Okay, you thought I was gonna leave you hanging with the last one, but I promise you that I am not. Shortly after Michael's disappearance that we just talked about, that same creep Russell was charged with stealing 3 steaks that totaled to $4 from a local grocery store. The witnesses to this crime were Jay Fry, who was a produce manager at the store, as well as a woman named Ruth Martin, who had seen Russell toss the steaks into his car after stealing them. Both Jay and Ruth were called to testify as witnesses, but on June 2nd, 1976, Ruth went missing and her abandoned car was later found with blood inside. 3 months after this, Russell broke into Jay's home and shot both Jay and his wife, which took both of their lives. He was caught for this crime and was sentenced to 300 years in prison. Okay, so what does this have to do with Michael and Ruth? Well, no one knew what happened to either of them until 10 years ago in 2011. Russell became terminally ill in jail and decided that then was the time for him to make some deathbed confessions, and he confessed to taking both of their lives as well. Unfortunately, neither of the bodies have ever been found, but it is absolutely insane to think that 4 innocent lives were taken over some stolen records and $4 worth of steaks. In our number 7 spot today, we have David Kelly. David was a nuclear scientist and weapons expert. In 2003, he had an off-the-record conversation with a BBC journalist in which he explained that the dossier that the UK government had created in reference to Iraq's nuclear weapons capabilities was actually falsified. Despite this being off the record, the conversation was reported widely and ended up coming back onto David. Just a few weeks after this, David went for a walk in the woods near his home, but he never returned. Of course, search parties were sent out to look for him after his family was worried when he didn't return, and he was later found dead, but the circumstances were quite mysterious. Just a small trigger warning before heading into this next part, as it was ruled that he did take his own life. It is said that David had taken coproximol, which is a painkiller, and that he had also severed his ulnar artery in his left wrist with a pruning knife that he had since he was young. This is obviously horrific, but not necessarily the most suspicious thing, but here's where things get weird. Firstly, those who spoke to David that day explained that he seemed to be tired but was in good spirits, and despite being in a bit of trouble, he received a lot of support for his honesty. The weirdest thing is that neither the blister pack for the painkillers or the knife had his fingerprints on them. There were no fingerprints on them, which would suggest that the items had been wiped clean, which certainly would be very bizarre. Despite it officially being declared personally inflicted, many people believe that foul play was much more likely. In our number 6 spot today, we have Mauro de Moro. Moreau was an Italian investigative journalist, and it is said that his profession is most likely what led to his disappearance. On the evening of September 16, 1970, he was coming back home from work but never actually returned. Before his disappearance, he apparently was convinced that he had the story of a lifetime, and he had even told his coworkers that he had a story that was going to shake Italy. There are 3 main speculations and theories about what this story might have been and what could have happened to him. One theory is that the story could have been related to the death of a man named Enrico, who was the president of Italy's state-owned oil and gas conglomerate Eni. The next was that his story could have been about finding a drug trafficking network between Sicily and the United States, and the final theory is that his disappearance might have been related to a failed right-wing coup that took place in the 70s. Despite extensive searches, he has never been found, and in fact 2 of the main detectives who started the case both had their lives taken by the mafia. It is believed that he was the victim of what is called a lupara bianca, which is a journalistic term for when the mafia takes the life of someone in such a way that their body will never be found. Whatever story he was working on, we'll likely never know, and it's such a tragedy that his job he was so passionate about is what most likely led to his disappearance.
Imagine you've just uncovered a secret so massive, so dangerous that it could topple governments or bring down billion-dollar corporations. You decide to tell the world, but then, just as your story hits the headlines, you vanish. No goodbye, no trail, just an empty room and a growing list of questions. He told his family, if anything happens to me, don't believe that it was an accident. Days later, he was found deceased in a hotel bathtub. Danny Casolaro was a freelance journalist in the early 90s who stumbled upon a conspiracy that he called the Octopus. He believed a secret cabal of government officials and organized crime figures were using a stolen software program called Promise to spy on global banking and intelligence networks. Casolaro had spent over a year tracking this shadow group across several continents, claiming it linked the Iran-Contra scandal to the 1980 October surprise. On August 10, 1991, Casolaro was found in a Sheraton hotel in West Virginia. Despite the gruesome nature of the scene where his wrists were cut 10 to 12 times, authorities ruled that he had took his own life within hours. The suspicious part? His briefcase, which he told witnesses contained his final breakthrough notes, was missing from the room. Furthermore, a professional cleaner was allowed to scrub the room before a full forensic investigation could be completed. She was the only journalist to ever land a private interview with Jack Ruby, the man who unalived Lee Harvey Oswald, and she told friends the JFK case was about to blow wide open. Dorothy Kilgallen was a media powerhouse, but her real passion was investigative reporting. She was highly critical of the Warren Commission's report on the JFK assassination. She managed to obtain a 102-page transcript of Jack Ruby's testimony before it was officially released, and she claimed that she had secret information that would prove a conspiracy involved more than just one shooter. In 1965, she was found unalived in her Manhattan townhouse. The scene was bizarre though. She was found in a guest bedroom that she never used, wearing a blue bathrobe and full makeup, with a book upside down in her lap. The cause of death was ruled to be an overdose of alcohol and barbiturates, suggesting that she took her own life or had a tragic accident. But the hook is that her folder of notes from the Jack Ruby interview was was gone. Her hairdresser later claimed that Dorothy told him that she was carrying a secret that made her fear for her life just days before she passed. He spent 32 years at Boeing, but when he started talking about cutting corners and safety failures that could lead to oxygen masks failing, he ended up unalived in a hotel parking lot. This is a modern day tragedy. John Barnett was a quality manager at Boeing's North Charleston plant. In 2017, he blew the whistle, claiming that workers were under such intense pressure that they were fitting substandard parts to the aircrafts. Most chillingly, he claimed that tests on the 787 emergency oxygen system showed a failure rate of 25%, meaning 1 in 4 masks might not work in an emergency. In March 2024, Barnett was in the middle of giving legal testimony in a whistleblower lawsuit against Boeing. He failed to show up for the third day of his deposition. He was found in his truck in the hotel parking lot, and the official report stated that he took his own life. However, his lawyers pointed out that he showed no signs of depression and was actually looking forward to winning his case. His family continues to this day to push for a deeper investigation into the circumstances of his passing. He was a brilliant researcher who helped build ChatGPT, but after he went public saying that the company was violating laws on a massive scale, he was found unalived in his apartment at just 26 years old. Sachir Balaji was a researcher at OpenAI for nearly 4 years. He played a key role in developing the datasets that were used to train GPT-4. However, he became disillusioned, claiming that the company was scraping private and copyrighted data without permission or compensation, essentially breaking the internet. He quit in August 2024 and gave a bombshell interview to the New York Times, becoming one of the most prominent technical whistleblowers in AI history. In November 2024, Balaji was found deceased in his San Francisco apartment. While the medical examiner ruled that he took his own life, his family has publicly challenged the verdict. His mother reported that his apartment appeared ransacked, and a private autopsy they ordered allegedly showed injuries inconsistent with the official report. Furthermore, family members claim that sensitive documents Balaji was preparing to use in court were missing from his devices after his passing. He exposed how the CIA was linked to the 1980s crack epidemic, and for his reward, his career was destroyed and he ended up with 2 holes in his head. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb published Dark Alliance, a bombshell series claiming that CIA-backed Nicaraguan Contras were smuggling white powder into Los Angeles to fund the rebellion. This report essentially linked the US government to the crack epidemic that ravaged American cities. The backlash wasn't just from the government. Major newspapers also attacked his credibility until he was forced out of journalism. In 2004, Webb was found deceased in his home. The official ruling was that he took his own life. However, the report stated that he had died from 2 bullet wounds to the head. Never released more documents that he was rumored to have been collecting.
In our number 5 spot today, we have Henry Baltimore Jr. In 1973, Henry was a 21-year-old honors student at the University of Michigan who had a very promising future ahead of him. In March of that year, Henry was unfortunately attacked inside of his apartment. 2 men broke in and tied him to the bed before stealing both money and material items. Henry was reluctant to report this incident to the police, but did end up doing so. After this, a suspect named Roy Davis was arrested and charged with armed robbery, and Henry was scheduled to testify at his hearing, but never showed up. 2 days after the hearing, Henry did resurface and asked the prosecutors to drop the charges because he was really frightened, but they refused and Henry was rescheduled to testify. 2 days before this rescheduled hearing, Henry ended up disappearing very suspiciously. Originally, people believed that he may have gone into hiding considering how vocal he was about being frightened, but that belief quickly went away and people began to suspect something a lot more sinister was at play. Henry's family especially knew something was wrong because there was no way he would disappear without telling at least one of them. Without Henry and his testimony, Roy ended up taking a plea deal and only was sentenced to 6 weeks. Roy was of course considered a person of interest in Henry's disappearance, and a neighbor of Henry's even said that they saw Roy and another man knocking on Henry's door the day that he disappeared, but Roy's mother offered her son an alibi, so Roy has never been formally charged for the disappearance. The 2 theories of what happened to Henry are either that someone abducted and took the life of him to prevent him from testifying, or Henry left Michigan, changed his identity, and assumed a different name. You would have hoped if it was the latter he would have at least told one member of his family. His case remains open almost 50 years later, and who knows? If someone out there who's watching this video knows something about this case, please call in and give any and all information over to the authorities. The remaining family members of Henry's deserve to know what happened to him. In our number 4 spot today, we have Lena Chapin. If you're a fan of the show Unsolved Mysteries, this might be one you've you've already heard of. Lena and her 5 sisters were constantly moved around growing up depending on who their mother, Sandy, was seeing and where the new boyfriend or husband lived. Shortly before becoming a teenager, Lena and her family moved onto a farm owned by their 3rd stepfather, Gary. Gary apparently was actually quite a good stepfather and was quite kind to the girls, but after a few years, Sandy began to have an affair with a local 21-year-old, as well as writing bad checks on Gary's bank account. When Gary learned of this, he of course talked to a lawyer about a divorce, and shortly after this, Gary disappeared. Flash forward years later when Lena is 17, after keeping a horrible secret for all of those years and being filled with guilt, she comes forward to Gary's brother to tell him that she knows what happened to Gary. Lena explains that her mother Sandy had actually taken his life, burned his body, and made Lena help clean up the scene and all of the evidence, and then they drove down a country road and threw his bones out of the window. Unknowingly to Lena, Gary's brother Albert was actually recording this whole confession, which he of course hands over to the police. Now that the police are confronting Lena and her mother Sandy about this confession, since Lena is 17 and Sandy is still her legal guardian, Sandy convinces Lena to walk back her confession, and since it was recorded without her knowledge, it isn't admissible evidence. A few more years go by and Lena doesn't speak of the crime again and ends up getting a job, having a baby, and she lives with her boyfriend, and then right before turning 21 years old, which would make her of legal age to testify against her mother in court, she just disappears. Everyone in the family, especially her sisters, are convinced this disappearance has everything to do with her mother Sandy and was done to keep her quiet. While this mystery is still unsolved, it's extremely likely we all already know what happened to Lena, but we just need the evidence to prove it. In our number 3 spot today, we have Oliver Munson. In January of 1983, a teacher from Baltimore named Oliver Munson purchased a used vehicle. Just a couple months later, Oliver was surprised to find out that the vehicle he purchased was actually stolen, and that the man who he purchased it from, named Dennis Watson, was actually the leader of an auto theft ring. Oliver of course had no idea about this dark history and agreed to testify against Dennis in court. Flash forward to February of 1984, just 3 days before Oliver is meant to testify against Dennis. Oliver leaves his home for work in the morning but never shows up at the school and ends up never being seen again. 3 days after he disappeared, his car was found 2 blocks away from his home with a flat tire, and shortly after this discovery, a stolen vehicle was discovered that had traces of blood in it, as well as a spent casing from a bullet. This vehicle also contained 2 receipts from a video store that had Oliver's name on them, which of course led authorities to believe he had been abducted and killed in order to prevent him from testifying. Unfortunately, because of lack of evidence, Dennis was never charged, and Oliver has never actually been found. This whole thing is of course so tragic, as Oliver was most likely a completely innocent party. In our number 2 spot today, we have Clinton Glenn. Okay, I'm sensing a trend here. Apparently people who abduct and take the lives of people to stop them from testifying don't usually do that just once. Previous to Oliver, who we just talked about, Dennis had another shady happening in reference to a witness testifying against him. In 1973, a 29-year-old man named Clinton Glenn was scheduled to testify against Dennis at an armed robbery trial. The day before this testimony, Clinton was unfortunately found burned to death in a car that belonged to none other than Dennis. Dennis did end up getting indicted for this crime after another witness came forward, and we were so close to seeing some real justice, but the case ended up being dropped after this other witness died of a suspicious overdose. At some point you'd think all of this would end up getting Dennis charged and convicted with all 3 witnesses' deaths, but of course this is all circumstantial evidence, and it would be terrible to have seen him be acquitted of these crimes due to there not being enough evidence to pin him at the scene. To end off these horrible stories on an extremely creepy note, Dennis was convicted of auto theft and received a 10-year sentence, but after being paroled in 1989, he kind of just fell off the map and his whereabouts have been unclear since then. In our number 1 spot today, we have Karen Silkwood. Karen Silkwood is well known for the worst reasons. She was an American chemical technician and a labor union activist who was very vocal and often raised concerns about the corporate practices that related to the health and safety of those working in a nuclear facility. You would think this is something that all of those working in the field would be concerned about, but apparently not. She worked a job making plutonium pellets and was the first woman on the union's negotiating team, and after she testified testified to the Atomic Energy Commission about the things she was concerned about, it was discovered that she had plutonium contamination on both herself and in her home. Plutonium isn't an issue outside of the body, but can easily be ingested or inhaled, which is when it creates a major problem for humans. Karen was driving to meet with a New York Times journalist and an official of her union's national office after deciding to go public with some of her findings, and the people who saw her right before she left for this meeting saw her with a binder full of documentation of her findings. During her trip in her car there, Karen ended up driving off the road and striking a culvert, and this accident took her life. Here's where things get suspicious though. That binder I just mentioned was never found. It was said that Karen had fallen asleep at the wheel, and almost twice the recommended dosage of methaqualone was found in her system, but there were clear skid marks on the road which suggested Karen was trying to get the car back straight on the road, and despite the accident being entirely at the front of the car, there was damage to the back of the car that friends and family say wasn't there before, and paint chips were found which would suggest a car had hit her from behind. To make this whole thing even more suspicious, apparently Karen was receiving threats before her passing. There have of course been claims of foul play and claims that she was run off the road by another vehicle, but unfortunately with little evidence, these claims have never been able to be proven for sure. But what is for sure is that whatever really happened to Karen, it seems like a simple accident doesn't cover the full truth.
She was on her way to meet a New York Times reporter with a folder full of evidence regarding plutonium smuggling, and she never made it to the meeting. In 1974, Karen Silkwood was a technician at a nuclear plant. She began noticing terrifying safety violations, faulty fuel rods, missing plutonium, and workers being exposed to radiation without their knowledge. She even found herself mysteriously contaminated with plutonium in her own home, leading her to believe that she had been targeted. On November 13, 1974, Karen was driving to meet a union official and a reporter. She supposedly had a folder of documents in her car. Her vehicle though was found crashed into a concrete culvert, and Karen was unalived. The documents completely missing from the crash site. An independent investigator found skid marks and a dent in her rear bumper, suggesting that she was rammed off the road by another vehicle. A journalist who worked for the president of Belarus vanishes at an airport after exposing government death squads. Dmitry Zavadatsky was a cameraman for Belarusian state media. He had previously been the personal cameraman for President Alexander Lukashenko, giving him intimate access to the regime. However, he grew disillusioned and began filming a documentary about secret execution squads used to eliminate political rivals. In July 2000, Zavadatsky drove to the Minsk airport to pick up his colleague. His car was found locked and abandoned in the parking lot. Zavadatsky was gone, and in 2002, 4 men, including former members of a government special forces unit, were convicted of kidnapping him, but his body was never found. To this day, it is widely believed that the order came from the very top to stop the release of his documentary and keep the death squads a secret. He was a journalist who took down a 4-star general, and right before his car exploded at 4:30 a.m., he sent an email saying that he was being watched by the FBI. Michael Hastings was the reporter who wrote the Rolling Stone article that led to the resignation of General Stanley McChrystal. In June 2013, Hastings sent an urgent email to colleagues stating that he was working on a story about the CIA and needed to go off the radar. Hours later, his Mercedes was filmed traveling at high speed through a Los Angeles intersection before it veered into a tree and exploded. Former security official Richard Clark stated that the crash was consistent with a cyber attack on the car's computer. Hastings was cremated against his family's wishes before a private autopsy could be performed, and the FBI later admitted that they had an open file on him despite previously denying it. She was the one-woman WikiLeaks who exposed the deep corruption of Malta's elite, until a car bomb silenced her just 30 minutes after her final blog post. Daphne was an investigative journalist who spent years exposing how top-tier politicians in Malta were linked to money laundering in the Panama Papers. On October 16, 2017, she posted her final blog entry, which ended with, "There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate." Minutes after she drove away from her home, a remote detonated bomb destroyed her car. The investigation eventually forced the Prime Minister of Malta to resign and revealed a conspiracy involving businessmen and government officials. She didn't just vanish, she was vanished in the most public, terrifying way possible to ensure the secrets that she held were never fully explored by the legal system. They were investigating a shadow mercenary army in the heart of Africa until they were ambushed in the middle of the night and their sensitive files disappeared. In 2018, 3 Russian journalists, Valery, Alexander, and Orkan, traveled traveled to the Central African Republic. They were investigating the Wagner Group, a private military company. They were looking into how the group was trading military protection for gold and diamond mining rights. While traveling to meet a fixer who claimed to have evidence of Wagner's training camps, their vehicle was ambushed and all three were unalived. While the official Russian investigation blamed local rebels for a robbery, the journalist's driver survived unharmed and gave conflicting reports. Their high-end cameras and equipment were left behind, but their laptops and hard drives containing their investigations were taken. They vanished from the story that they were trying to tell. These cases serve as a chilling reminder that the truth often comes with a heavy price. Whether it's corporate greed, government corruption, or underground spy networks, these people paid the ultimate price for trying to bring the shadows into the light.
Helena Holmberg was an Argentine diplomat born in 1931. She worked her way up through the Foreign Service and became one of the first women to graduate from the country's main diplomatic school. By the late 70s, she was posted in France, working at the embassy. In 1978, she was suddenly called back to Buenos Aires after issues with naval intelligence officers she'd been dealing with. Well, once she got back, she was working inside the foreign ministry as usual. On December 20th, 1978, she left the building during the day saying she was going to meet a group of journalists. She never made it to that meeting. She was taken off the street by a military task force. At the time, Argentina was under a military dictatorship, and people were being picked up like this all over the country. Holmberg was taken to a secret detention center run by the Navy, where prisoners were held and interrogated. On January 11th, 1979, her body was pulled from a river just outside the city. It had been there for a while before anyone found it. People started pointing fingers at the high-ranking Navy officers. It was pretty obvious she'd been unalived after uncovering things she wasn't supposed to see. Mauro De Mauro was an Italian investigative journalist. By 1970, he was working for a newspaper in Palermo, digging into big stories about crime and corruption. He'd already made enemies over the years with pieces exposing organized crime. One of the things he was working on in September 1970 was a research project about a powerful Italian energy boss who died in a plane crash under very suspicious circumstances. De Mauro was convinced there was more to that crash than anyone had been told, and he was chasing leads. On the evening of September 16, 1970, he left work and walked home in Palermo, but he never made it inside. Men grabbed him off the street and he disappeared. Thousands of police and investigators searched Sicily, but they never found his body. His disappearance became one of the most talked about mysteries in modern Italian history. Over the decades, different theories have come up about why he vanished, and almost all of it has to do with him finding out too much. But decades later, there's still no definite answer, and his remains yet to be found. Alexander Parapolikny was a Russian businessman who got caught up in one of the biggest corruption scandals in Russia. He'd worked in finance and later became a whistleblower, helping expose a scheme where billions of dollars were being siphoned out of Russia through fake companies and moved into Swiss accounts. This case had already led to the death of Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer who'd uncovered it, so Parapolikny knew he was dealing with extremely dangerous people, but he continued his work, passing documents to Swiss authorities and other investigators trying to follow the money. In 2009, he moved to the UK with his wife and children, hoping to stay safe, and for a few years, he seemed to have escaped the danger. But on November 10th, 2012, while out jogging near his home in southern England, he suddenly collapsed. He died at just 44 years old. At first, police said it must have been a heart-related issue, but it was much more disturbing than that. Toxicology tests later found traces of a rare plant-based chemical. It wasn't possible to definitively prove that he'd been poisoned, but given what he'd been involved in, it would make sense. As for how they'd have managed to poison him, that's the unsettling part. Who the hell knows? Even years later, his death is still a mystery. Ross Alderson is, or maybe was, an Australian who was living in British Columbia, Canada. He spent years working for the British Columbia Lottery Corporation, starting in 2008 as an investigator focused on stopping money laundering in casinos. Over the next 7 years, he worked his way up, eventually becoming the director of anti-money laundering investigations. He held that director position until he resigned in October of 2017. During his time there, Alderson repeatedly raised concerns about money laundering in casinos and tried to push the issue internally. As he moved up, Alderson started having health problems. Some colleagues said he seemed under a lot of stress, and there was also talk that he might have been dealing with mental health issues. Despite this, he was willing to help with a commission of inquiry in British Columbia in late 2019. He told reporters it was necessary and that he was willing to help. But when he was summoned to appear, he never showed up, and nobody could get in contact with him. He's been missing ever since. No one knows if he moved back to Australia or if something more serious happened. Now we're going way back. William Morgan was an ordinary guy living in upstate New York in the 1820s. He worked various jobs: stonecutter, bricklayer, storekeeper. He wasn't famous or important before 1826, but his life changed when he announced he was going to publish a book that would reveal the secrets of the Freemasons. Morgan wasn't a complete outsider to Freemasonry. He convinced local Masons that he'd been initiated, but some members started questioning whether he was really a member or not, and rejected him. This pushed him to team up with a newspaper publisher to write a book exposing what went on inside that secret organization. When word got out about this, Masons were obviously not happy. In September 1826, Morgan was arrested on minor, highly questionable charges, like failing to repay a tiny debt, but he was conveniently thrown in jail before his book could be published. Shortly after being released from jail, he was taken away by a group of men and never seen again. His body was never found. At the time, there were protests. People demanded answers. They were outraged by this. The case was never solved. Joshua Dean was a guy who knew too much about what was happening inside the factories of Spirit Aerosystems, a massive supplier for Boeing. He worked there as a quality auditor, which basically meant his entire job was to make sure the planes were safe before they hit the runway. Well, in 2024, Dean went public with some heavy allegations, claiming the company was ignoring defects in the 737 MAX. He talked about mechanics misdrilling holes and management pressuring workers to basically look the other way when it came to how many flaws they were finding, just to keep the assembly line moving. Dean was relatively young, 45, and by all accounts, he was a total health nut. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he was obsessed over his fitness, but just 2 months after another Boeing whistleblower, John Barnett, was found dead, Dean suddenly got hit with a nasty bacterial infection. It started as a bit of a breathing trouble, but within days his lungs were failing, his heart stopped, and he was diagnosed with an MRSA, a type of staph bacteria infection. He died in the middle of his legal battle against the company. Doctors couldn't explain how this healthy guy's body just gave up so fast, leaving a lot of people wondering if his sudden illness was really just bad luck or if there was some shady business going on. In 2004, Guy Andre Kafir was a French-Canadian journalist working in West Africa, specifically in the Ivory Coast. He was digging into the cocoa industry. Kiefer found evidence that the massive profits from chocolate were not going to farmers. Instead, he was tracing a trail of money that led directly to government officials who were apparently using the funds to buy illegal weapons and pay off private militias. Kiefer was supposed to meet a government worker at a shopping mall in the capital city for an interview. He walked into that parking lot and was never seen again. As investigators dug into it, they found he'd been abducted by a group of armed men. Turned out some high-ranking politicians were involved. One witness claimed Kiefer was held in a basement and interrogated before being executed. They never found his body, though. His family has spent over 2 decades fighting for answers, but the trail has gone cold. Gareth Williams was brilliant with numbers. He worked for GCHQ, which is kind of like Britain's version of the NSA. His whole job was cracking codes and following money trails, figuring out how criminal organizations and terror groups moved cash around without getting caught. Well, in 2010, police found his body in his London apartment, and the scene made absolutely no sense. He was zipped up inside a duffel bag, sitting in his bathtub. The tub was empty, and the bag was padlocked from the outside. The police fumbled the whole thing from the start. I mean, their first theory was that it was some kind of accident during an adult act. There was literally nothing to support that. There were no fingerprints on the padlock. There's no DNA from anyone else in his place. So then the other question was, well, how could Williams have zipped himself inside and locked it without leaving any trace behind? They even brought in a professional escape artist, to try and recreate it, and none of them could pull it off. But somehow the Metropolitan Police closed the case and called it an accident. Word was that Williams had been digging into a huge money laundering operation connected to Russia right before he died. A lot of people think that a hitman got past his security, unalived him, and just arranged everything to be as confusing as possible for investigators. Jill Dando was one of the most famous faces on British television in the late 90s. She hosted Crime Watch, a show where they helped police solve cold cases. Well, in April of 1999, she was walking up to her front door in a quiet London neighborhood when someone approached her from behind, grabbed her, and fired a single shot into her temple. It was a contact shot, meaning the weapon was pressed right against her skin to muffle the sound and to ensure that she did not survive. It was a professional job carried out in broad daylight. Investigation was massive, but it went nowhere for years. They eventually convicted a local man with mental health issues, but he was later cleared because the evidence against him was basically non-existent. Rodolfo Rincon Taracena was an investigative reporter for a newspaper in Tabasco, Mexico. In 2007, he was focusing on something extremely dangerous: small shops that were actually fronts for cartels. And he named names. He detailed exactly how the cartels were recruiting young people, which local politicians were taking bribes to look the other way, and how the entire criminal underworld was operating in the city. On a Tuesday evening, he walked out of his office to head home, and he vanished. He never even made it to his car. A few years later, a captured cartel member claimed that Rincon had been kidnapped and interrogated about his sources before being dissolved in a vat of acid. Ray Gritkar was the district attorney for Center County, Pennsylvania. In 2005, he told his girlfriend he was taking a day off to go for a drive. Well, he never came back. His car was found parked outside an antique mall near a river. There was no sign of a struggle, but his keys and cell phone were missing. The weirdest part was his laptop. Months after he vanished, it was found under a bridge in the river. When investigators opened it up, they realized the hard drive had been removed. Grikar's disappearances often linked to the Jerry Sandusky case at Penn State. Back in 1998, Grikar was the one who declined to charge despite several allegations, but some believe that by 2005, Grikar was secretly reopening that file and found new evidence that would have brought down a lot of powerful people at the university much earlier. Others think he might have been looking into a big illicit substance trafficking ring. Whatever the case, though, it was probably all on that missing hard drive. Someone obviously needed it destroyed for a reason. Grikar was declared legally dead in 2011, but with no body and a missing hard drive, the case is still unsolved. Philip Taylor Kramer had two completely different careers. He was the bass player for the rock band Iron Butterfly and was also a literal rocket scientist. You don't hear that very often. By the 90s, he was working on something called fractal compression, basically technology that could send massive amounts of data, like high-quality video, through regular phone lines. This was way before streaming existed, of course. What he was working on could have been worth a fortune to media companies. In February 1995, Kramer was supposed to pick someone up at the Los Angeles airport, but he never showed. While he was missing, he made a bunch of panicked 911 calls. In one of them, he said he was going to unalive himself. But he also made a statement that people have been curious about for decades. He said, quote, "I want everyone to know O.J. Simpson is innocent. They did it." It sounded like he was having a breakdown. His family said he was scared, like someone was after him. In 1999, some photographers spotted his van at the bottom of a deep canyon. His body was still inside. Because of his work with advanced technology and government contracts, some people believe his quote-unquote breakdown was either faked or caused by someone else. And maybe he was taken out because the technology he was developing was worth billions to the wrong people. Frank Olson was a scientist who worked on biological weapons for the CIA back in the 50s. He was part of MKUltra, the now infamous government program that experimented with mind control. Olson had recently come back from Europe, where he'd apparently witnessed some truly horrific human experiments. He was so shaken up about it, he wanted out of the entire program. Shortly after he told people he wanted to leave, he was brought to a retreat with other CIA officers. Without his knowledge, they slipped LSD into his drink. Well, a week later, Olsen was staying in a New York hotel room with a CIA handler. According to the official story, he jumped through a closed window and fell to his death. For 22 years, the government told his family his death was caused by a nervous breakdown. The truth about him being slipped the psychedelic only came out in 1975, and the story gets worse. In 1994, Olsen's son had the body dug up for another autopsy. The examiner found a big bruise on Olsen's forehead, a wound that happened before the fall, not during. It looked like someone had knocked him out before throwing him out the window. Is it possible that Olsen knew too much about the CIA's illegal experiments, and because he was so clearly disturbed by it all, they were worried he was going to talk? Yeah, it seems highly possible. Oral Geisha Omar Shanova was a journalist in Kazakhstan who went after stories that most reporters did not want to go anywhere near. In 2007, she was looking into violent clashes between ethnic groups in a small mining town, but the real target of her investigation was government corruption. She was tracing how profits from the area's mines were being stolen by wealthy elites, while the workers who actually did the digging lived in poverty. She was last seen in the city of Almaty getting into a jeep with several men. She told her coworkers she was going to meet a source who had solid information that would help with her investigation, but she never came back. And the Kazakh government barely investigated. In a place where the government controls most of the media, Omar Shanova was one of the few reporters who couldn't be paid off or scared into silence. But to this day, no one knows where she was taken or where her body is. So this one's deeply unsettling. Francis Nayeri was a freelance journalist in Western Kenya, known for digging into corruption and shady dealings by police and government officials. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance in January 2009, he'd published a series of articles exposing financial scams and fraud involving local police officers, including issues with a housing project meant for officers. People that he wrote about started threatening him, and friends said he'd started getting nervous about going out alone. Well, on the morning of January 15th, 2009, Nayeri left his home saying he was going to buy construction materials. Then that was the last time his wife or anyone else saw him alive. 2 weeks later, on January 29th, his body was discovered in Kodera Forest, far from his home. His hands were tied behind his back. His head had been separated from his body. Investigators later found that a taxi driver had driven Nayeri with 2 police officers and some local gang members. The driver said that Nayeri was beaten and taken into the forest, where of course he was unalive. Now, arrests were made and there was a trial, but infuriatingly, no one was ever convicted. Sandeep Kothari was a journalist in Madhya Pradesh. In the months before he disappeared, he put out stories exposing this huge illegal iron ore operation, naming people and companies involved. After those reports, he started getting threats, but he kept doing his work. On June 26, 2015, he went out in a busy part of town to run errands, and he never came back. Witnesses later said that a group of men forced him into a car, and of course, he was reported missing right away. 2 days later, on June 28th, his body was found near a creek outside the city. The case has been dragging on ever since. At this point, for 11 years. There have been 3 arrests, but so far, no actual convictions, but the case is still ongoing. David Kelly was a British scientist who worked for the government as an expert on biological weapons. He'd spent years inspecting weapons programs and was considered one of the top people in his field. In 2003, not long after the Iraq War began, a BBC report came out claiming the British government had exaggerated intelligence about weapons of mass destruction to justify going to war. That report caused a huge political fight between the government and the BBC. Behind the scenes, Kelly had spoken off the record with a journalist connected to that story. His name eventually got out. Once that happened, everything escalated. On July 15th, 2003, he was called in and grilled in front of Parliament about what he'd told the BBC. 2 days later, on July 17th, he left his home in Oxfordshire and went for a walk, and he didn't come back. The next day, his body was found in a wooded area nearby. Supposedly, he'd taken his own life, but I mean, come on. He'd just been exposed as the source in this major political scandal, questioned on live television, and within days he's gone? Highly suspicious is an understatement. Daphne Jose Metzger was a Brazilian blogger who ran his own site where he wrote about crime, local politics, and of course corruption. In early 2015, he'd been working on stories about dealing of illicit substances and the exploitation of minors. He'd been staying in a small town for a while, digging into it and trying to get more information. People who knew him later said he'd been getting threats because of what he was looking into. He was last seen around May 13th, 2015, and after that, he just disappeared. A few days later, on May 18th, his body was found in a remote area after police got an anonymous tip. And there was no question as to how he died. It was gruesome to say the least. He was missing his head, and the lead up to that wouldn't have been pleasant either. Whoever did this was sending a very clear message. But to this day, no arrests have been made.